Hi, everybody. This is Adam Elenbaas from Nightlight Astrology. It's Monday, May 21st, and today we're going to take a look at the meaning of the sun's entrance into the sign of Gemini. We're going to talk a little bit about Venus's opposition to Saturn, which is approaching very shortly. And we're also going to talk just a little bit about fate and free will in astrology, which is a topic that I've been getting a lot of questions about from readers and stuff like that. Not that I'm any kind of expert and have all the answers, but I'll try to share a few thoughts today that may be interesting for people who want to know more about how fate and free will get along in astrology. So that's our agenda for today. But we're going to start by talking about what does it mean that the sun has just entered the sign of Gemini. So that's just happened in the last 24 hours here. The sun has just moved on into the last sign of spring in the northern hemisphere. The language of astrology in Western tropical astrology is set to the rhythms of the seasons by the equinoxes and solstices that define the starting points of the four zodiacal seasons. We have, for example, Aries starting the spring season, and that portion of the zodiac is correlated to the first basically 30 days of the sun's annual journey from the moment that the sun, the light takes over and the days become longer than they are shorter. That's what the spring equinox is basically indicating. And so now we're moving through the spring season. We went through Taurus, which was the middle portion, the middle 30 days of the spring. And now we're moving into Gemini, which is basically the last 30 days. So what I want to do is, almost forgot to pull up, I have a little set of notes that I want to pull up for this. I want to talk a little bit about the signs and how they were perceived or understood by traditional astrologers compared to how they are in some ways used and understood today. So, and this will help us to understand Gemini. It's sort of a little prelude to understanding the solar sign of Gemini. We first of all remember that in ancient astrology, the signs were called zoidions, and that was the Greek name for them, and they meant the place or home of a god. The seat of a god, but also they referred to a kind of an icon or an image, and they had the connotation of being the temples of the planets. So when we say that they were the seat or throne of a god, what we really mean is when we say Gemini, when we talk about the sign of Gemini, we're really saying this was the celestial domain of Mercury, who is Hermes in Greek myth. Now there are equivalent and very interesting, you might say, there's correlations at least between these, semi-divine figures and the demigods in Indian mythology. So there's real interesting connections between you can look at the interesting connections between the different planets and demigods in the East. Fascinating. But at any rate, they were the signs were the homes of the planetary gods. The planets themselves were not thought of as the gods in the Western tradition. They were thought of as the stars of the gods, meaning they somehow indicated the will and the unfolding, basically organizational laws and decrees of the gods, and that way the gods are seen as conducting the flow of life in the material world on some level, like a cosmic bureaucracy. They're sort of in charge of the organizational process on some level, and this is something that can go down to the level of the winds or the rains or the weather, down to the movements of air and bile and fluids in the body. And it gets macro and micro, that the gods were thought to be really orchestrating a whole lot of the sort of physical laws of the material universe. Now, so that's just a little, kind of background on how the planets were thought of. And then these signs are their homes. So when you're talking about Gemini, first and foremost in the ancient world, you're really talking about the airy, masculine home of Hermes, of Mercury. And so that's a totally different flavor, for example, than the earthy, feminine home of Mercury, which is Virgo. And they have very different moods and sort of flavors. And Mercury sort of administrates and executes his responsibilities, you might say, differently in those two signs. It's not the same Mercury. Just like you or I, in some ways, we might show up differently at our home, in our private sphere, as we do in the workplace. Planets also tend to feel a little bit more at home in one sign that they rule versus the other. For example, Virgo is both the domicile ruler and exaltation ruler for Mercury in Virgo. However, Mercury in Gemini has no exaltation lord. And there's some very interesting esoteric components there's reasons that is the case. But at any rate, in modern astrology, one of the ways that we typically think about the signs is we think about them in terms of the signs themselves having certain kinds of psychological characteristics that we use in a descriptive way. So with Gemini, we say things like, well, that person is flexible and adaptable, and they're quick on their toes, and they're clever, and they're street smart, and they're two-faced, and they change their mind a lot. And we immediately take the sign as an opportunity to psychologically qualify or describe or characterize usually a person, an individual. And we tend to associate individuals and their characteristics by their sun sign. So you would usually say you would make those kinds of descriptions if someone said they had their sun in Gemini. So that's kind of the general way that we use the characteristics of the sign. So that's a very modern approach. It's lovely. It works. And it's a part of a more modern trend of doing solar sun sign astrology, which I do myself, and I have great respect for. However, ancient astrologers did not, as a rule, look at someone and say, "Oh, you tell me your sun sign." We don't see that at any rate in any of the ancient texts. There's always a strong emphasis upon the luminaries, the sun and the moon. And there's also sometimes masters of the nativity, very prominent planets that kind of have the CEO duties of the birth chart, let's say. And there's elaborate procedures that ancient astrologers had for sort of determining that. But it was not unanimously, that your sun sign sort of determined who you were as a person, characterized you. The study of temperament was largely based on the ascendant and the moon and Mercury. We see that throughout a large portion of the history of astrology. The sun sign, in other words, is not a defining characteristic of the study of temperament. It may play a role. So these are important things to know, because when we talk about Gemini, usually, in a talk about Gemini, what you're going to go right for is trying to understand the psychological or behavioral characteristics of someone with the sun in Gemini. We need to start by remembering that, like everybody in the world is very unique, right? And so there's two things to remember. One, as a spirit soul, as an eternal being, made in the image of the divine, you might say, or in the same as the same divine substance as the eternal whole source that we come from, but we each have our own individual form as spirit souls. That form is not something that you find in the birth chart, right? It's something that you find in how you live the life that's described by the birth chart, and how you use the freedom that you have to meet the karmic material reality that's described by a birth chart, or how you use the free will that you have to make intelligent choices during and through the kinds of influences described by any given day of astrology, or by the things described in the birth chart, or the transits that happen in the birth chart. So it's just important to remember that as these two things as a starting point. You're a spirit soul, not necessarily your birth chart is not you. And secondly, your sun sign is not usually it's not even the most descriptive planet in the chart of your personality or behavior. It takes multiple levels of analysis to get a sense of how a person behaves, acts, what makes them happy, what motivates them, et cetera, et cetera. So in modern astrology, one thing that is good in this sense is that we do have more in-depth ways of looking at the psychology or behavior of an individual through the birth chart. Modern depth psychology, which is a very spiritual endeavor, which is attempting to find and connect with our sense of it having an eternal nature. That study, that discipline, is intimately connected to the idea that you have an entire birth chart that's helping you describe who you are and how you behave and things like that. So, but there is a large, just kind of common modern attitude in astrology that thinks, well, I'm really like my sun sign. So we just have to start basically with that. The next piece that we have to go toward is understanding how it is that these psychological characteristics that we're so used to hearing about with regard to the signs are arrived at. Like most people will say something like, well, Mercury is like Gemini. And and if you ask them to describe Gemini, they'll say, well, it's like Mercury, right? So it's like the dog chasing its own tail. Or you'll say, well, tell me about Gemini. And they'll say, well, let me tell you about the third house. And then you say, tell me about the third house. And they'll say, well, I'll tell you about Gemini. You say, tell me about Gemini, I'll tell you about Mercury. Tell me about Mercury, I'll tell you about the third house, right? So we don't ever, and part of the reason for this happens is because one of the inventions of modern astrology is the marriage and conflation of signs, ruling planets, and houses together, whereas in ancient astrology, they were separated. So you have some association, for example, between certain planets and topics in the houses, but the signs are never like conflated and wed archetypally to the houses. So that's a more modern invention, and there are clear associations that can be made that are nice between signs and houses. Like there are, in fact, some things in common between Gemini, Mercury, and the third house. However, for ancient astrologers, there's much deeper astronomical reasons for assigning the topics of the third house in the way that they were assigned. There are there's a totally different planet, the moon. The joy of the moon is the third house, and the assignment of Mercury in to houses was actually in the first house for ancient astrologers. And there are very actually amazing and totally beautiful reasons for all of this that I think I'm very passionate about. It would make us all a little bit better at astrology if we at least learned these things so that we knew the difference in practices. At any rate, so when you think of Gemini, when you think of the different characteristics of Gemini, flighty, two-faced, quick, smart, witty, communicative, curious, easily stimulated, easily distracted, you hear all those things. Very rarely does anyone like land on a solid and this is why, right? It's without going to, well, Mercury or, well, the third house or, something like that, or etc. So what we need to try and understand today is why do those characteristics come up for Gemini? So that's what we're going to talk about. All right, so I'm going to go forward here. And what we want to talk about is understanding what's happening with the sun in the northern hemisphere as it's moving through its stages of the year. In the sky, what is the ecliptic doing? Means the path of the sun. What is it doing? Well, when it's at spring equinox, it's halfway between the lowest point, the lowest arc in the sky, which is the summer solstice, and the highest arc in the sky, which creates the longest day of the year at the summer solstice. Halfway in between that marker, while the sun is tracking, the arc of the sun is tracking up in the sky, meaning the days are getting longer, we cross the spring equinox point, and there's an equal amount of light and dark in the 24-hour period. Now, that marks the takeover of the sun in the solar year. We're entering the yang half of the year, where there will be more light in the 24-hour period than there is darkness. The sun and the light predominate. That's why we say Aries is the exaltation of the sun. Then we move into Taurus, and then we go to Gemini. And when we get to Gemini, we're reaching the topmost arc, because the very end of Gemini, we hit that topmost arc, the summer solstice. And from there, then the sun's arc starts dropping down in the sky day by day until we get to the fall equinox, where it's back at the same place as the spring equinox, halfway between the highest and the lowest arcs. But it's setting now, and the yin half of the year will take over. That's why when we cross into Libra, we say the sun is in its fall in Libra. At any rate, and then we go all the way down to the winter solstice, and then we start to climb back up. So the sun is doing that journey from highest point in the sky, longest sort of arc, all the way down to lowest arc, shortest day, with the halfway points of the equinoxes. So what we have to do is we have to track and understand the unique dynamics of each of the phases of that total unfoldment in the sky, and understanding the kind of seasonal archetypal meaning of that astronomy. We can make a very quick understanding. We can have a very quick understanding of the characteristics that accompany the signs. So here's something to think about. The sun in Gemini is ascending toward its final, the longest day of the year. When the sun is on the ascending half of the year, right, it is also moving higher and higher into the sky, which means further away from the southern horizon, and higher up in the sky, which means it's moving toward the north. So when the sun is moving higher and higher in the sky and moving toward the north, its arc, its trajectory, is tracking closer and closer to the pole star. Now, the pole star is an unchanging, sort of fixed center. It's very important to understand that for ancient astrologers, the idea of an unchanging fixed center around which other things orbit is at the heart of ancient astrology's metaphysical theory. Let me try to explain why very briefly. Every day, the planets rise and culminate at like high noon, and then they set. And they go round and round like that. The primary motion brings everything through the sky uniformly, round and round and round. And it's the fastest motion in the sky. No planet is faster. So everything is being carried by this mighty primary motion, right? And that primary motion is associated by ancient philosophers who had great influence on the early founders of horoscopic astrology, like Plato, who said that primary motion is reflective of the one, the source, the God, the divinity that everything comes from. And on the other hand, all of the planets have their own individual specific motions, and those motions go against the grain of that primary motion. So, for example, even though everything is carried from rising in the east to culminating above to setting in the west, planets are running along the opposite direction in their own speeds moving through the zodiac. So the sun, day by day by day, if you didn't have the Earth rotating on its axis and creating that primary motion, you would actually see the sun from our perspective moving through the zodiac out in space from west toward the east. And all the planets do the same thing. They're all moving in the opposite direction that they're being carried, from rising to culminating to setting. So because they're moving in contrary, against the grain of that primary motion, and because they all have their own idiosyncratic natures and speeds, they were thought of as reflective of the world of coming to be and passing away. That is the realm of time, the realm of materiality. So we have, in other words, we have a reflection of all different kinds of eternal beings represented by the primary motion, who are reflections of the source that they come from, embodying in all different kinds of vehicles that fluctuate through life and birth and growth and adulthood and old age and death, and then they recycle and they go round and round like that. Similarly, the planets and all of their idiosyncratic speeds and activities in the sky are reflective of the world that we live in, filled with all different kinds of forms that cycle predictably, and that in some ways also go against the grain of that eternal divine order. So for ancient astrologers, for example, this would explain why human beings set out into the material world to try and gain happiness somewhat fruitlessly. against the grain of the mighty primary motion that just says, yeah, you're never going to overtake that. There's nothing in the material world that your endeavors will ever accomplish that could possibly overtake that thing. So, for example, in the material world, we spend a lot of time looking for happiness. What am I going to do, and what's going to make me happy? And we do all sorts of things, but eventually it falls apart. Just like whatever we're here to do in this specific lifetime in this specific body, eventually will fall apart. That's it. So similarly, ancient mystics saw that the astrology and the movements of all of the planets set against the grain of that primary motion describe an embodied eternal soul coming into a material world and dealing with the laws and mechanics of a material universe, and somewhat fruitlessly, spinning our wheels in the realm of karma. Just spinning our wheels in the material world, where people are always talking about all the stuff that's going to make them happy, but they never actually really get it. And if they do, it's very fleeting. Or even if they get it for a long time, eventually they fall down from it. So that's a kind of mystical philosophy that was common to Stoics, Platonists, yogis, all sorts of ancient mystics who were practicing astrology. They had a very similar view of life in the material world. And the birth chart is really describing the parameters of that world. Why is all of this important to Gemini? Because when you want to understand any sun sign, first you have to understand that the sun itself is demonstrating a fluxional, repeatable, observable cycle. It's behaving in a material, it's reflecting cycles in nature that are in the material world and that are repetitive. And how do we know that it is so? Because we see that the sun has a center around which it orbits, and that is the pole star. So throughout the year, all the planets are orbiting around the sun, right? So it becomes really tempting to also place this all-powerful status upon the sun. Oh, it's centrally important. But the reason that we do so is because everything orbits around the sun, and we are drawn toward the sense that everything in this world that's cycling through all these fluxional changes must be related to something eternal that doesn't change. So typically the sun becomes this important symbol. But the reason that it's capable of also reflecting all these different fluxional changes of its own, like the psychology of a Virgo or the psychology of a Scorpio or the psychology of a Gemini, is because it itself is also a fluxional symbol in the material world. So, for example, we see the sun rise and culminate and set every day. Also, during the solar year, the sun itself has a fixed center around which it orbits. When it's low in the sky, it's farthest away from the unchanging pole star, the North Star. When it rises up in the sky toward the summer solstice, it draws closer to it, and then it falls away from it. So the sun itself demonstrates that kind of fluxionality, and it's very important because once we understand that, we also understand that the sun is not exceptional. There are some astrological philosophies out there that will tell you, the sun is like all important in your chart. Everything orbits around it. It's a source of light. It's a source of luminosity. All of this. But it's important to understand that there is no symbol in astrology that doesn't fall into this some level of being a fluxional symbol that demonstrates some kind of change relative to something that appears more unchanging. So that symbolism is a very important part of the philosophy of these ancient mystics. So when we get to Gemini, what's happening in the solar year? The sun is rising up to the highest point where it's the longest day of the year, and it's going to be closest to the pole star. So what does that represent? Well, symbolically, what that would represent is, for example, the let's say the spiritual ideal of moving closer toward the source, the unchanging center. So Gemini has an idealistic quality to it. It's a masculine sign. It's airy, and it has this ideal. It's inspired by goal orientation, because it's during that time of year we're moving up toward the pole star, closest that it will get. Now that could be like a spiritual idealism. Geminis, in other words, can be people who are very, they're aspiring students, they're aspiring thinkers, etc. However, you could also say that the aspirational quality of Gemini, that movement toward the pole star, is also just a simple ambition. It's an ambitious sign. It's a sign that is interested in goal orientation in general, right? However, what happens as soon as the sun reaches its goal, the critical finale, grand finale of Gemini is the immediate turn of the solar year to start dropping down again. This is where we get the duality of Gemini from. It's the fact that Gemini is climbing and ascending and moving towards something, but as soon as it has it, it lets it go. It turns around. It leaves it behind. It starts to fade. It starts to dissolve. So we always have, in ancient mythology about Gemini, we have the sign of the twins, Castor and Pollux and so forth. And much of the mythology surrounding the twins will have to do with a light and a dark side. Well, where does the light and dark side come from? It comes from the duality of this moment where the sun is aspiring towards something, but then immediately upon attaining it, falls away, loses it, starts falling down. So that duality in Gemini is often expressed in terms of, well, I have an interest in something or a goal or an ambition, but once I have it, I am immediately prone to letting it go. I'm immediately prone to saying, well, I don't know what that was, So if you ever, you heard the phrase curiosity kills the cat. Curiosity also just has a natural way of killing its own interests. So whatever you get curious about, you get into it, you mess around in it, and you like that, you get all fascinated by it, and then eventually you lose interest in it. The stimulation is over. It's like the first 20 minutes after you have a cup of coffee, you're like, oh my God, everything's great, and I have a long list of things to do, and today's going to be wonderful. An hour later, how do you feel? You're either like, well, I need another cup of coffee, or you're like, okay, back to work, back to the real life where, the stimulation lasts for a little bit and then dissolves. So Gemini is critically aware of the way that the nervous system can be stimulated towards something with a kind of attraction and impulsivity, but will quickly dissolve and turn. That's just a quintessential part of what the solar year is showing us in this moment. So there's that to think about. There's also Gemini loves a good, a tryst, or Gemini loves. Sometimes it's said to love gossip. Well, what is it about gossip that's so fascinating to us, right? It's like, well, there's something interesting, and let's talk about it. Let's get into it. And it's like a cat playing with a ball of yarn. It's a way of, idly trifling around with something, and then once the fascination with the topic has exhausted itself, then you switch the topic and start, talking about something that's also dramatic and interesting and whatever. Well, this is why Gemini is easily associated to the realm of information on the web, the internet, the streaming updates that you get on your phone, the clicker, pull your phone down, refresh. All of that, in a sense, is really reflective of the same exact idea of the solar year in Gemini. I'm interested in something. I get it. It dissolves. It fades. So it's that refresh, and the little circle spinning around and around. Now, if you're somebody who, the same exact archetypal qualities can be dovetailed very nicely with your spiritual life. For example, to apply yourself curiously and with a certain amount of ambition to spiritual things, to investigation, study, communication, listening and hearing about spiritual things. If you can stimulate your body kind of constantly and keep hitting the refresh and keep hitting the refresh and keep hitting the refresh, and it's about immersing yourself in spiritual devotional life, well, that can have great effect. I mean, that can be really, really powerful. That can change you, and that can make you, in time, you can become actually very intelligent about where and how to apply your mind, your energy, your focus, about what stimulates your nervous system and mind in a good way and what doesn't, about what kinds of things to say or not say in relationship to other people. So, ultimately, again, it breaks down to how do we use the free will that we have to understand this kind of influence and to use it in the best manner possible. Here's some funny quotes that I thought you guys might like. This is from the famous Gemini rapper. It's a very good, rap, anything that's very lyrical and flowing and quick and changeable. Tupac, who famously said before he was murdered, "We look at death from the selfish side, like, that guy died. Oh, it's so sad. Why is it sad? He's away from all this bad stuff that's here on earth. At the worst, he's just somewhere quiet, no nothing. At best, he's an angel, or he's at the next existence, or he's a spirit somewhere. What's so bad about that? It's only bad for the people he left. You guys are mad. That's like some crab in the bucket type of stuff." I mean, that's a harsh analogy, but that's what it's like, though. Right? There's Tupac, right? I'm not trying to exalt those statements as particularly wise. I'm just trying to give it an example of the Gemini mood, So, that's some of the playfulness of Gemini, but also the sense that there's nothing really at stake. It's all play. It can be very easy to take on an almost nihilistic attitude about life with Gemini. There's no commitment. Sometimes we say with Gemini, well, there's no commitment. Hermes is not like Zeus, his opposite sign partner, who is committed and faithful and has beliefs. Hermes is more prone to saying, well, I don't know, maybe this, maybe that, maybe it's true, maybe it's not true. In some ways, Hermes is the agnostic, the skeptic, the atheist. Hermes can, very quickly use verbal trickery and deception to get out of different kinds of moral and spiritual responsibility. So, but Mercury is also capable of sweet talking us. So it can be the sometimes the way that God works in our life and wants to bring us along the spiritual path. He needs to be very clever. It's like God needs to be God needs to be very clever and basically trick us into developing spiritually. And so Hermes is like that too. Hermes can be the psychopomp, the guide of the soul, who tricks and lures us into spiritual learning. And so that's like that as well. Tupac also said, "I don't have no fear of death. My only fear is coming back reincarnated." So on the one hand, he's saying, this is all just meaningless. Death, it's not a big deal. You're just going to go someplace good, right? Et cetera, et cetera. But then next breath, he says, the only thing I don't want to do is have to come back here and deal with this, which is really like kind of deep and profound and a lot more committed position than saying like, it's just whatever. It's, what's so bad about dying? You're just going to be somewhere, no nothing, or something relaxing. On the other hand, he's like, yeah, but I believe in reincarnation and I could come back and it might not be so good. At any rate, he also said, "It's the game of life. Do I win or do I lose? One day they're going to shut the game down. I got to have as much fun and go around the board as many times as I can before it's my turn to leave." So there's that nihilistic attitude. There's that, I'm uncommitted. I don't care, right? But we also know, based on Tupac's life, that he cared very deeply about certain values. He valued, he was, in a sense, he was a modern advocate for the furthering of civil rights for young Black Americans, and just he did care about a lot of things. He could be very convicted about his beliefs, but then other times he could act like it doesn't matter. It's all just a game. This kind of duality is also reflected by the sun reaching its ideal and then immediately falling away. And this is why we say that it's the temple of Mercury. We don't say, well, we're going to, arbitrarily some portion of the solar year is Mercury's and then we're going to slap a zodiacal sign on it. Do you know what I mean? It's the other way around. We say, okay, this is what the astronomy of the year is like. And then we associate that time of year and we say, well, that's Mercury's home. That's one of Mercury's homes, that time, that place. Okay, so then we get some ideas about Gemini. Does anybody have any questions about Gemini before I go on? So let's just summarize a few things that we talked about. Then I'm not seeing any questions in the chat box for now. The sun is not the most all-powerful symbol in astrology. Like all symbols in ancient astrology, it was a part of it, considered to be reflective of some piece of material reality that was governed by predictable, repeatable laws and cycles. The demigods that are pulling the strings, that are kind of like the administrators of the laws of this universe. But then on the other hand, it was also the planets were also seen as, reflecting in some way the spiritual condition that we find ourselves in the material world, which is in some ways we're separate from our home, and we're spinning our wheels here, trying to find eternal, unchanging, abiding peace and happiness in things that can't help but just keep cycling. And that is not the place to find that eternal sense of happiness. So, I always use this example, but it's like, you're really hungry. It's a hot day. You think to yourself, it's been a rough day. I'm going to have a whole pint of ice cream to myself. How long does that happiness last? You know what I mean? And then the guilt that comes with it, or the pounds or the calories or whatever else. Not saying you shouldn't eat ice cream, but you get what I mean. It's that version of happiness is exactly what ancient astrologers thought that were being depicted by the planets. The fruitlessness of trying to find happiness in a fluxional state that's constantly just being falling away. So that we have to remember that the sun sign, Gemini, is reflective of different kinds of modes, moods, characteristics, behaviors, psychologies within the material world. But A, the sun is not the most important symbol. And B, it is not depicting necessarily your eternal form, as much as it is depicting something about who you are in this particular body, in this particular lifetime, how you behave and act, the lens or filter through which your eternal agency comes through. And those are very distinct. And once we know that, reason I focus on these things is because we have to ground into that reality so that we don't get lost in you can easily become like an echo box, especially with Gemini, where all of the signs become gossipy chatter in our heads that are circling endlessly, saying, this is who I am, this is who I am, I'm like this, I'm like that, I'm like this, I'm like my T-square, I'm like my grand cross, I'm like my kite, I'm like my I'm 5 planets in water, I'm like, and that doesn't really help us to develop a sense of being an eternal being. Not that those things can't participate in self-understanding and self-growth and spiritual development, but it doesn't help when we approach an understanding of signs without deeper grounded knowledge about what we're doing and why we're doing it. So, I'm an imperfect messenger. I do my best to try and explain some of this stuff. Hopefully it's helping everyone as they learn and study more. All right, so next thing we're going to talk about is Venus opposing Saturn. Now, Venus opposing Saturn is something that, let me just get my other view up here. Venus just entered Cancer over the weekend, and so welcome Venus to Cancer. And then it's going to be opposing Saturn over the coming weekend, Friday, Saturday, etc. So what does that mean? What should we expect from that transit? Well, first of all, Venus in Cancer, we're talking about we are talking about the goddess, the planet of harmony, friendship, beauty, love, aesthetics. Venus likes to bring unlike things together and blend them into something that is beautiful or pleasing. When she enters Cancer, she's in the home of the moon, a water sign, feminine sign. She gets real domestic, and real familial. And for example, Venus in Cancer is as Venus enters Cancer, I'm currently redoing my daughter's bedroom and my wife and my bedroom in preparation for my wife's having another baby this July. So, we're doing a little bit of home nesting, right away. Venus entered Cancer, it was like right away the impulse came, and I was like, oh, there's Venus in Cancer. Well, yeah, we do have to change around the rooms for the baby coming. So starting to do that and kind of nest or what have you. Very Venus in Cancer. But it's also the Venus in Cancer is also the strands and threads and heart stuff that bind us together in familiarity. It's one of the hardest things in the life that we live. One of the hardest things to do is to be a family member, right? How many people are in therapy talking about their families? You know what I mean? How many of us are sweating our daily existence, both because of the attachments and the aversions that we have to family ties, to whether that's in Cancer, whether that's racial or ethnic or cultural, or whether that's about your family of origin or your own family that you started. Their deep emotional bonds and wounds, and Venus in Cancer often is a little window into those attachments. And also, usually, because Venus will make some aspects, some of the hurts and pains and aversions, and some of the loss and grief that we have in those areas. And I'm mentioning those things especially because as Saturn goes into an opposition, or as Venus goes into an opposition with Saturn, that's precisely the kind of encounter that Venus is about to have. Saturn, on the other hand, in contrast to Venus, is a planet of darkness and decay and old age and mortality. Also, the wisdom and maturity of old age, sobriety, focus, seriousness, being someone who is sober and wise and clear and grounded and disciplined, all Saturnine things, but not usually the emotional attachment piece. That's not as Saturnine. Sometimes there's a kind of anguish or heaviness or depressiveness that can come with Saturn, but it's not the same as that sweet sort of heart-tearing emotional attachment and care as Venus in Cancer. So at any rate, as Venus approaches the opposition to Saturn, we're going to be looking at the difference between Venus, who wants to bring things together in this lunar kind of feminine, watery way, and the austerity of Saturn, the age and maturity and sobriety and the sadness or the heaviness. Those themes are opposing one another. Well, I'll be going tomorrow morning. I leave for a funeral. My wife's grandfather passed away last week, so I'll be right in the thick of that all week. You know what I mean? And it's also interesting to note that one of the biggest astrology conferences in the world, UAC, is happening this weekend, where you have the themes of like all astrologers who are kind of like a family getting together. The possibility of sort of brotherly, sisterly love of one another and community. With Venus in Cancer, you can feel like a family very easily, a tribe, but opposing Saturn, right? So, but I'm a traditional astrologer. You're a modern astrologer. You're an evolutionary astrologer. These camps and factions and sects that want to say, not in my family, you're over there. You have this level of importance, but that's all. You go over there. So that kind of tendency to want to isolate, cut off, create sects and hard boundaries and divisions, whereas Venus in Cancer wants to bring it all together, etc. Well, those energies are opposing one another this week, right? So let me give you another short example. Just as Venus enters Cancer, and I'm trying to fix all these bedrooms in my house, the bed that we're taking apart we're putting a different bed in our bedroom. We're going to put the bed that we got right after we were married, which is kind of too tall for my daughter. And so she crawls into bed and stuff. So, and we don't want her falling off from it, because she did fall off once. And at any rate, so I'm trying to disassemble this bed last night with some movers for like 2.5 hours in the sweltering heat, and it just wasn't working. So it was like this. The day started off with this really sweet intention. By the time my wife comes home from work, the bedroom's going to be totally redone. I'm going to have it all done. But instead, it was like this immovable beast that we were joking that we needed. we needed some dynamite basically to get the bed apart. So this lovely intention, Venus in Cancer, was met with this hard resistance, this bulky, thick, like nice bed, but it was like bulky, heavy, and it won't move, and it won't be taken apart, and it won't budge, and we can't figure it out, and frustration, you know what I mean? So that, and then I found that, very easily I was like, all right, I'll just, sent the movers home, had dinner with the family, relaxed, and try to laugh about it. So there's like that Venus-Saturn tension all week that we're going to be facing. So you can see it play out in family events, in emotional depth and attachment versus maybe more austere or grown-up detachment. It can go either way. It can sometimes be too harsh or rigid, or other times it'd be really mature and say, no, you got to grow up emotionally a little bit. Same thing with my daughter. She's learning how to sleep on her own more right now, without, kind of needing us in the night and stuff like that. And we've co-slept with her, which is a unique way of training kids to sleep. And it's been really nice, though. And she's learning how to sleep on her own right now, and she's going through a rough patch. Well, that's, it's that Venus-Saturn opposition. It's, I need you, I want you, I need you, I want you, but I'm also trying to be on my own. I'm trying to be independent. I'm trying to learn how to go to the bathroom for myself. I'm trying to learn how to sleep on my own. So that Venus-Saturn tension like that. So I hope that gives you some ways of thinking about Venus-Saturn for the week. I realized that I forgot to mention one thing about Gemini. Every sun sign, what I like to do in talking about the sun signs is say, okay, what's the highest spiritual virtue of this sun sign? Like what could we learn from the sun sign that's of great value? And while I mentioned that Gemini can immerse itself regularly, hit the refresh button, and stay constantly stimulated by spiritual life, if one gets attached in the heart to the divine, then we can constantly get curious. It can become our cup of coffee. We don't need the coffee as much as we need the sacred music, the sacred text, the sacred community, and those things can work on our hearts. And so that energy of Gemini, if it stays curious, and if its drug of choice can be something divine, then it's really it can be very enlightening, and it can be something that can stimulate a lot of growth. It's like Gemini is a hot, moist air sign. Hot and moist are conditions for plant life. And that means you can grow. Things can grow. Your devotional mood and spiritual life can grow with the constant life-giving conditions of Gemini's curiosity and need for stimulation. So that's one great spiritual lesson from Gemini. But another one, just going back, is that having that understanding of duality, where you're heading for some ideal or some goal, but you know that it'll fall away. You know that you'll be separated from it again. That can be a profound kind of spiritual understanding, right? First of all, I don't know one spiritual tradition that doesn't start with that first noble truth, that all is impermanent, that everything that rises will fall. Are you talking about Taoists or Buddhists or yogis or Christians, Sufis? So many people agree on that point, that you have to be very careful not to get attached to the ride up, because there will be a ride down, and that cycles like that. So Gemini has very clever and highly intelligent and joyful and spontaneous and good-spirited understanding of that in some ways. That's why often in Native American mythology, one of the figures that embodies some of the most important divine messengers that deliver people from the clutches of their ego and attachment to things is the trickster. The trickster is often a figure who's bringing us out of some kind of mental trap where we get stuck in thinking something is it. And then it has to be robbed or taken away or stolen away or pulled out from underneath us or tricked away from us, to remember, no, this keeps going around and around. It's actually, I can't find what I'm looking for in that. So the tricksters do that. But the other thing is that if you think about how do you build intimacy if you're a divine soul, you're an eternal soul, but you're also part and parcel of a supreme God. And if that's the picture, I don't know whether you believe in that or not, just entertain this theological idea for a minute. If you're a part and parcel of the whole, then your most important thing to do is to figure out how to cultivate a loving, beautiful relationship with that whole. You're a part of it. So how do you serve it, or how do you become intimate with it? Well, one thing that we sometimes value in spiritual circles is the idea of becoming one with something, right? And that's fine. There's all different kinds of traditions that have different theological opinions, and that's, one that people value. But another virtue or value that's found in the Bhakti Yoga tradition is the idea that you cultivate intimacy with the divine. But in order to cultivate intimacy with the divine, it's also important that there is some level at which you remain a unique soul-ensouled being. It's not fully the same as, does not ever fully merge with the Godhead, but that you need some level of separation, some level of distinction between you and God for there to be a free will choice to engage in a loving, deep, intimate, blissful, infinite relationship with. So you have to have some level of separation. Gemini understands that very, very well. And so the twins, right? There's nothing that a twin hates worse than being said, oh, you're just the same. You're just the same. Now, we may look the same, but we're actually very different, right? So one of the high spiritual virtues, you could say, of Gemini is the idea that by seeing this rise and turn and fall, there's also like almost like a tantric, you might say, understanding of the need for the movement between union and separation. Union and separation. Lovers come together and then they part. And it's the parting and the separation that makes the coming back together sweet. So there has to be some level of distinction between me and you. Gemini, as a Mercury ruled sign, is also at its best when discovering and exploring distinctions between things, analyzing the component parts, the ultimate purpose of which is so that intimacy between things, relationships between things, can actually be forged. And so that's the idea of the entire like neural network of stuff that we can connect. Some of it is a total waste of time and just overstimulation. Other things that we get to know very intimately in all of its parts facilitate intimacy, intelligent intimacy between intelligent, divine things. So that kind of the articulation of those differences is a part of a very kind of exalted, intelligence that Gemini can demonstrate that's relational. So I wanted to add that in because sometimes that's sort of forgotten with Gemini, and I had it in my notes, my mental notes, and I forgot to mention it. All right, last but not least, fate and free will in astrology. I'm trying to get done within an hour, so we'll make this real brief. Fate and free will in astrology. Now, there are three popular beliefs about fate and free will in astrology. Throughout the history of astrology, you'll find that these are very common. One is that everything is predestined. Two is that everything is everything is pretty much radically open. It's total create your own reality, radical indeterminism, right? Radical, you're freestyling. Everyone simultaneously is co-creating reality as it goes. There's nothing preset at all. It's all being radically, indeterminately created in the present. Okay. And then there's the view everything's sort of predetermined and mechanical, and the real freedom is totally in consciousness and nothing to do with the material world. And then you have a sort of middle ground. And the middle ground is usually something along the lines of there are certain elements of life that are preordained, destined, or fated. And there's also some component of free will. So those are the three basic choices that you have sort of philosophically. Now, I can tell you that I don't like the extremes, right? Myself, this is just my own opinion because people have been asking me to share my thoughts on free will. So I can tell you, first of all, it's very useful and valuable to explore those things. But intellectually exploring something that's not paired with sadhana is spinning your wheels. So to intellectually explore anything from psychology to religion to art or music without picking up an instrument, without sitting down to pray or meditate, without doing those things regularly as you're studying the intellectual component of the knowledge, for the most part, is not going to help you evolve in your understanding of the things that you're studying. That's just practical, hands-on experience has to be matched with theoretical study. So first thing I want to say is that you have to, if you just like the sound of a particular thought about fate and free will, you're like, that one sounds really nice. I like that one. That makes me feel good. That doesn't cut it, in my opinion. And I tell my students this too. I'm like, that doesn't cut it. You have to weigh and measure your views of fate and free will. It can't be. It's not the same as liking a movie that you're going to. It's not the same as just aesthetically making a choice to say, well, that one's attractive to me. Following your attraction, of course, is important. Your aesthetic, what is beautiful, is often connected to what is true, as what Plato told us. But it's very important to measure and weigh out the reality of your views about fate and free will in living practices that you develop. And you have to be really honest with yourself. You have to be like an objective student of the views that you're looking at. And that's not easy to do because we have a stake in the matter. So we're not objective for the most part. And it's hard to be fully objective. You can't be fully objective, right? You're a participant. So, but that's the first thing to say. The next thing is that I don't like the extremes personally, that you create your own reality. Everything is radically indeterminate, being totally and completely co-created in the present moment. Doesn't work for me. Neither does the extreme view that everything is completely mechanically determined. So those views don't work for me. So I land somewhere in the middle. So here's how I would describe it. And I should say that so much of what I say in these talks, by the way, comes from the people that I consider my teachers, especially in the past year or so, from the Bhakti yoga tradition and other teachers that have been instrumental for me as an astrologer, and then weighing them out against thousands of readings and my sadhana, my daily practices. So that's how I've arrived at these views, but they're still going to deepen. I consider myself in many ways just a total neophyte, so at any rate, the middle view that I take is often described by like an analogy that's made in the Bhakti yoga tradition from a number of different teachers. I've heard this. The life is like, in some ways, it's like an airplane ride. You've gotten in the airplane has taken off, and the airplane's destination is, let's say, Mumbai, or let's say it's France. You're leaving from the United States. You don't have any control after the airplane takes off, right? Of the fact that you are now in a vehicle that is going from the United States to France, or the United States to Mumbai, or something like that. However, within the parameters of the airplane, there's a lot of stuff you can do. You can read a book, you can watch a movie, you can surf the web, you can go up and use the bathroom, you can talk to anyone, you can do all sorts of crazy things on the airplane that could be really destructive, right? Right. So the way and so there is a sense in which the general parameters of your free will are set out by the birth chart. The birth chart tells you that there are certain things that are going to happen in certain areas of life, certain trips from the US to France, right? And there are certain destined components of our karma accumulated that are set out to tell us that we have a certain amount of like good stuff and not so happy stuff to experience at certain times in our life, in certain areas of our life. I have to believe in this because, and I'm not trying to toot my own horn at all, but myself and any decent astrologer I've ever talked to has been able to accurately predict the highs and lows of my life since I was a child, right? Like I've sat down with astrologers who have been able to tell me, when people have died in my life, at what times people have died, at what time I've gotten, really important gigs professionally, at what time I've had difficulties with family or friends, at what time I've gotten married. I mean, you can't, there's, you can't make that stuff up, right? And at least that's where I'm at. After doing this, I see so many clients every week. Every session that I do, I sit down with people and I say, okay, so around this time you were experiencing this. Just a couple of days ago, I was doing a report for a woman and I said, boy, it looks like you had a really difficult time in 2015, right around this time. Might have been some really important transitions and some experiences of loss, might have been a little sudden or shocking. Yeah, family member died in a car accident. You know what I mean? And I'm telling you, like right now, like that's my daily reality. I see maybe 500 clients a year in different kinds of situations. And, I'd say 400 out of those 500, if I were to make up a number off the top of my head, will demonstrate some high level of predictability in terms of what times in their life, different areas of their life were being affected in subjectively high positive ways or subjectively negative low ways. None of which, by the way, necessarily has anything to do with the spiritual content of life, but just descriptively. The birth chart can map out a great deal of the trip from the United States to France, right? But there's also very clearly the birth chart can't describe everything and doesn't describe everything. So the way that I've thought about it has been very much like that analogy for a long time right now. So I heard that analogy, I was like, that is the perfect analogy. I really like that one. There's also, with free will, there's so much that you can, we often think of free will in terms of the parameters of the external field in which we have the ability to exercise it, right? So we say that we think of a person having more freedom as tantamount to being able to have more things, right? So someone who's in prison does not have as much freedom as someone who is living in California with a nice lifestyle, a nice, wealthy, like comfortable lifestyle, right? That's what we would typically think. And often we fight for freedom in life in terms of the external factors that seem to more encompass a more broad field of the potential exercise of free will. And so that's the Cadillac standard of how we think of free will. But actually, as we know, people like Nelson Mandela, who was in prison for a very long time, did extraordinary things within a very limited field of external circumstances, right? Freedom is not about necessarily the external circumstances of life, which so frequently people in modern astrology who really expound a very radically open, indeterminate future kind of position will take up, is that, well, we should be able to do anything we want. We shouldn't have any limiting beliefs. But actually, limitation in the external is somehow so intimately related to the real power of creativity and freedom. If you can find the unlimited source of creativity and freedom that is your eternal nature and relationship with the divine, then it doesn't matter what the external circumstances are. This is why Krishna in the Bhagavad Gita says, people want to develop a loving relationship with me and find spiritual bliss. They could offer me something as simple as a leaf or a flower or a piece of fruit. In other words, it's how we utilize freedom. We find the real meaning of freedom when we give something from our hearts creatively, despite what the external conditions are around us. That's the actual use of freedom. That's the actual meaning of freedom. But and oftentimes we think that in order to experience real freedom, we have to have no constraints externally. And that creates what I call the vision board culture. The vision board culture is one that wants to do away with all limiting conditions in my life, so I can have whatever I want. So in the Bhakti yoga tradition that I've been studying, the important thing is not necessarily your external circumstances, but the internal quality of consciousness that really makes you free or even capable of understanding and using free will. So many times people come to me and they say, well, I don't want any kind of predictive stuff when I'm doing this reading. I just want you to tell me about the potentials and, how I can use this energy to manifest the best things that I want. And from a more traditional perspective, certainly from the one I embrace, uh, that's spinning your wheels in the realm of karma. I mean, anything that you get from that kind of mentality will eventually go away, and narrower will become the external circumstances around you. As you define your happiness in terms of external things, and they frustrate you more and more and more, the external world starts collapsing in upon you. And it becomes more restrictive, specifically to set you up for the realization that true happiness is not found in the external. It doesn't mean that the external has to be evil either, but it's that you need, in a sense, limitation around you to discover that freedom is not about limitation. And we limit freedom when we think that it's about externals. So that's my view on fate and free will, and that's why predictive astrology is so important. You have to have predictive and descriptive astrology of external subjective levels of reality. We walk on uneven earth every single day, right? Some people are born fast, some people are born slow. Some people, their birth charts say they're going to rise to great success. Others say you're going to frustratedly try after things and fail. I see this reality every day in my practice. So and I see it in my life too. Like, that's my life. I'll give you a quick example. Had a really good month business-wise with these Uranus and Taurus reports. A lot of people got these reports. I'm thinking to myself, I'm going to do this, this, and this with that little wave of income that came in through a lot of people ordering these Uranus and Taurus reports. Immediately, upon thinking that, I'm going, let's not get carried away there. Let's not get carried away. Because the nature of the material world will deliver a bill on my doorstep. I can count on it, I can count on it just as surely as Venus leaving my financial house is going into the house of messages and messengers about to oppose Saturn in the 9th house of higher organizations. What happened is, just as Venus enters my 3rd house and opposes Saturn in my 9th, I got a letter from Amtrak saying that our property fence, is encroaching slightly onto their property. So we have to pay rent for 70 square feet of fence or something per year. But it translates into a lot of money. And I have to get a surveyor now to come out here and, measure the property and all this stuff. Gone. Just like that. 200 Uranus and Taurus reports, gone. So the message is, don't get stuck on any of it. You know what I mean? So the people, astrology is helping us to understand the external fluctuations, right? So that we can locate our free will, which is in our eternal nature, and then respond to those things externally that are beyond our circumstances in ways that constantly dovetail the opportunities of our karma with spiritual growth. That's what we're here to do. So as an astrologer, that's why I believe that you have to have some level of astrology that is predictive and descriptive. Without that, then we are deluding ourselves and following a path of, subtle psychic spell casting, trying to get stuff that we want. And it's a subtle form of trying to manipulate material forces to get us stuff. We don't even realize that slowly puts us in more and more of a prison. And I say that not as someone who's arrived anywhere, but just as someone who sees it all the time in my practice and in my daily life. So that's my view on fate and free will. I hope that's interesting to you guys. Of course, people may feel very differently about it. There's a whole history, right? Yeah, and Spencer, very good point. But you did have that money for a reason. Good thing you had that Uranus report success. Yeah, exactly. So it comes in, you get it. And then you think to yourself, well, it's going to do something for me. You start putting it in your bank. One of my teachers the other day was giving a talk, and he said, in the material world, it's like we're working at a bank, and we're constantly trying to hide the fact that we're stashing money from the till. You know what I mean? It's like, and the real, of course, if anyone knew that we were taking money from the till, they would be appalled, right? But it's so common amongst us human beings to try and act as though we're in possession of things. And if we all were to admit it and really understand it, the kind of transformation that it could occur through the recognition, and some healthy amount of guilt, and be like, wow, that's actually what I'm doing. I'm actually sort of stealing things all the time, thinking that they're mine or whatnot, when they're flowing through me. They come and they go. Anyway, all right. Well, I'm going to see if there's any questions up here, and we'll be done for the day. Let's see. The pole star, heart of metaphysics. This primary motion is reflective of the mystery of mysteries, because everything is moving contrary to the one. This is birth, death, time, and the forms of creation. The material world is fruitless by comparison. It falls apart. Yes, very good. Gemini can get attached to the divine as its prime curiosity, a drug of choice. Hot and moist like plant life. Yes. Okay, good. Isabella, my North Node is Gemini, and this is something that I have been grappling with in my intimate relationships, especially coming from a quite enmeshed family that gets anxious at the distancing phase. Oh, interesting. To the point where I want to run and separate very far. Anyway, thank you for this breakdown. Good. That's a nice application. Looking forward to UAC. Yeah, I'm excited to see some of you guys this weekend. That'll be fun. Fate and Free Will combo talk was great. When are you headed to UAC? I'll be there on Thursday, but I probably won't see many people until Friday. I'm coming, like I said, I'm going to a funeral for my wife's grandfather first. So, yeah, well, thank you guys. I hope you enjoyed this. There's probably more to add to the Fate and Free Will conversation to come, because there's lots of interesting things to talk about there. But yeah, thank you guys for tuning in today, and I hope you have a very nice week. Take care, everyone. Bye.